Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for stopping by. Sorry it's been a little while since the last vlog. I've been a little bit busy and sometimes, you know, making videos has to take second priority to doing the stuff that pays the bills. So what have I been up to? Well, I've been doing some photography workshops with clients. I've been running my one-day, one-to-one wildlife photography courses here in the New Forest, doing New Forest landscapes and our New Forest wildlife. So thank you to the people who've come on those days. I hope you got a lot out of them. You know who you are, so thank you. If you want to join me on a workshop of your own in the New Forest, then I will put the link down in the description, or you can see it right here. So the other thing I've been doing while we've had some bad weather days in the last week or so is a project that I've been meaning to get done since January, and like everything has got a little bit delayed, which is the creation of a new web portfolio covering a lot more of my work than has ever been seen before. So this is the proper Earth Stories website to go with this Earth Stories YouTube channel. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I've always been primarily a wildlife photographer, but I also do landscapes, and I also love to travel, and I also love to take travel images. So this is the first time that I'm going to have a portfolio covering all of those areas, with a lot of my work over the last 10 years all in one place. And it's been a really interesting exercise to create this portfolio. So I thought I'd use the video today to explain 4 main things that I've learned out of creating the fuller portfolio than I've ever had before. So the first thing I had to think about was how many images should it have in it, and how should they be categorized? How could I make this portfolio make sense to the viewer? There were so many different ways of approaching this, but the first thing I had to figure out was how many images I wanted to use, because I didn't want it to turn into some sort of encyclopedia of all my work. I think if there are too many images, then you start to pick ones which perhaps aren't your very best work, and it's important that it should be a focus on that. There should be tough choices involved. So I wanted to limit myself on the number of images, and as it turns out, looking through my Lightroom archive, I have about 9,000 images covering landscape, wildlife and travel in my Lightroom collection. And so I thought, well, if I come up with a portfolio of around about 90 images, that would represent the top 1% of my work, which seems like a good kind of rule of thumb to use. So I kind of had this figure of around about 90 images, and then I looked at the web theme that I was going to use, and as it turned out, the theme actually supported a layout that suited having galleries of either 9 or 15 images. So that gave me a choice of somewhere between 6 and 10 galleries within the portfolio. So I started obviously with my 3 base categories of wildlife, landscape and travel. And I knew that I didn't want to have just 3 galleries. I knew I probably wanted to have between 6 and 10. So I started to think about how I could break this down. Now, I could have done it by country, and that was certainly something that I considered, but that would mean mixing landscape, wildlife and travel images together, and I didn't really want to do that. I'd rather people got an idea of a particular type of work. They're very different. So what I ended up with was 6 categories. I decided to split the wildlife images into animals and birds and have 2 separate galleries, one for each of those. I decided to have a single travel gallery, and by travel that meant including images that were either had buildings in them or people in them, so they couldn't really be considered landscape images. I then decided to have a landscape category and a seascape category, just to divide those, although that wasn't actually my original intention. Originally I had a thought that I wanted to do a gallery that was dedicated to panoramas. As I went through and I started tagging all my panorama images to look at them, I actually found I wasn't that happy with quite a few of them. I've always liked doing panos, But I realised that maybe I need to do a little work on my panos. Maybe they're not my absolutely best work, and that actually the images that I collected somehow just didn't feel like they all deserved to be there. So in the end, the panos category went, and I decided to have a seascapes category as well. And then the final category, the sixth one, I decided to do a monochrome gallery, purely for wildlife, because I surprised myself there perhaps in having more images that were really interesting and really strong. So that one jumped out at me as a category that I hadn't perhaps initially considered, but really deserved to be there. So having collected together the 90 odd images and decided roughly how they were going to be split into galleries, one of the things I had to think about was whether there was a style of imagery that I particularly wanted to come through, and in fact asked myself a question: do I really have a style? Is it obvious when I put these images together, when I start to group these 9 or 15 images, how do they actually look? Do they feel like a coherent, consistent gallery? And I was quite surprised by the results, because I think of myself primarily as a wildlife photographer, and certainly most of the wildlife images that are in there are fairly close-up portrait shots. I haven't really ever considered myself a wildlife portrait specialist, but it turns out a lot of the images that I have are those sorts of shots, so that was an interesting observation. But actually, it was when I came to look at the landscape gallery and write some accompanying description for the gallery for the website that I really found it quite easy to express what my landscape style was. And it's perhaps not everybody's cup of tea, or perhaps not the sort of the classic style, in that a lot of my landscape images are quite busy. I don't really take the sort of lone tree against the skyline kind of image with lots of blank space. I actually take landscape images that are filled with detail, and whether they're big hero shots or more close-up intimate shots, that seems to be something that comes across. So it was kind of interesting to actually see that it quite easily jumped out at me that there really was quite a consistent style there. And of course that helps with the fact that with all my images, I have a fairly consistent processing post-production workflow that I follow, so I don't suddenly leap about processing images in wildly different ways. I tend to have a fairly consistent way of doing that. Perhaps the one gallery where consistency went out the window a little bit more, but in an interesting way, was in the monochrome gallery. It seemed to me that as I organised those images, that somehow these were amongst some of the most creative work that I'd done, and that somehow when I'm working in black and white, I take more risks in the creativity of the shots, in the way I process them. I love high key and low key black and white photography, so there's some examples of both those things. So rather than having a consistent way of processing and producing images, I tend to allow myself to go more to the extremes when I'm working in black and white to get more radically different results. So that was quite interesting, that I have a freedom when I'm working in black and white that I hadn't really thought about until I came to put this gallery together. And then I realised that, first of all, that creativity exists within me, and it seems to come out more in black and white. So maybe actually it's something that I should think about in terms of my colour photography, and taking a little bit more of that risk-taking and creative freedom back into some of my other work. So the third big learning of putting this portfolio together was identifying what some of my weaknesses are and being honest about them. And there were two things that definitely came across. One I think I knew about, the other one perhaps a little bit more of a surprise. So when it came to the travel gallery, I was looking at a lot of images that were shot in urban environments with a lot more people around, and that's not where I naturally feel at my most comfortable. I love the peace and quiet of the countryside. I love being in wild places. I love being in remote areas where there are no people around. That's very much my natural happy place. So it's always a challenge for me when I'm in busy urban environments. I'm always worrying about my camera gear. I'm worrying about getting in people's way. I'm worrying about stuff getting broken or stolen, or just something bad happening. So there's always a little bit of a natural sort of on edge that I feel when I'm photographing sometimes in cities around the world. But I have to try and overcome that. You know, I look at these people who are street photographers who are so happy and comfortable in that environment, happy approaching people, which I definitely am not. And so, although there are a few people photos in there, including one or two that I really love, possibly one in particular, a picture that I took in Havana in Cuba of a banana seller walking down the street with his wheelbarrow full of bananas, and it's got wonderful architecture in that picture. It's a great street scene. It's got the main subject, and it's also got some other groups of people. That's a composition and a photograph that I'm really happy with. One of my best travel photos ever, I think. But in general, am I a bit of a coward when it comes to people? Yeah, absolutely, and definitely getting up close and personal to people. There's just not enough images like that in my collection, so I really need to work on that. I need to get a bit braver with that, and I need to push myself to do more people photography, street photography on my travels. So that's definitely something I'm going to take a look at. But I knew that about myself. I knew that was something that was out of my comfort zone, so no great surprise. The other weakness that I identified, which I was a little bit more surprised about, was that although I went with the seascapes gallery over the panoramas, I realised when I came to put those images together that most of them were from a very small number of locations. In fact, a great deal of them were from a trip that I took about 18 months ago to Barbados, and that was just an absolute dream of an island location and a beach and a seascape location. There were so many compositions to shoot everywhere around that island. So that gallery feels really dominated by the Barbados pictures, and relatively little from anywhere else, including not as many from the UK. And I don't live that far from the coast. I don't live on the coast, but I'm within a half an hour drive. So there's really no excuse. So one of the other things I've realised I need to do is go and do more coastal landscape photography and mix up some of those beautiful exotic sunset pictures with maybe some more rough and ready kind of coastal pictures. I need to go out in some stormy conditions, some bad weather around the UK, and try and capture our coastlines at their more rugged. So that's a really interesting project that's given me to go away and try and tackle this year, to try and fill in some of the gaps from my portfolio that perhaps until I did this exercise I didn't really know those gaps existed. And so the fourth and last learning from doing this portfolio is a really important one, which is that it's an opportunity after more than 10 years of work to bring all these images together and take a minute to actually be proud of what I've achieved, because I'm quite a self-critic. I often find more fault in my images than I find satisfaction. I'm always keen to point out, oh yeah, it's a good photo, but there's this little thing, or I remember it could have been a little better, there was an opportunity that I missed. So it's important not to be negative about your own photography all the time. It's important to take a step back once in a while and celebrate it, and celebrate all the good things we have done. You know, with social media these days, we spend a lot of time worrying about the performance of individual images. You know, how many clicks and how many comments did that particular image get over that particular image. Even when it comes to things like awards, most of the time we're submitting single images for consideration rather than bodies of work. So it's important to actually take a step back and look at the work that you've done as a collection. You know, whether you're looking at a particular section of your work or whether you're putting together a bigger portfolio like I was and looking at everything that you've done over the last several years. I think it's really important to just say, do you know what, there's some good stuff in there. There's some stuff that I've worked really hard for. There have been some real successes that, all the places I've been have been wonderful memories and wonderful experiences. And one of the real joys of doing this was actually turning up some of my older images and finding that actually I felt okay with including them in my portfolio. Images that I shot 6, 7, 8 years ago when I was very much less of a confident photographer than I am now, but to actually realise that some of that work was really good And even now, 8 years on, it's not like it's just the images that I shot in the last 18 months that are my best work. There's still some great stuff from the past. So it's important to remember that, you know, even along the journey, even as we improve as photographers along our journey, there are still gems that we create at all stages of that journey. So the idea of putting this portfolio together and thinking about my work as bigger collections has given me some ideas to take away. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at doing some book projects this year, because I have done 1 or 2 collections of my work into books in the past. And I feel inspired to do that again as something to offer and a way of collating my work in a way that I really, really enjoy. So that's another project that's going to be happening in 2019, and I will record that process in a future vlog, I'm sure. But I thought I'd share that with you guys. Next time I talk to you, I'm going to be out in the field again. I'm thinking I definitely got a particular location here in the New Forest where I want to go and do some landscape photography, and I'm looking like I might get some decent weather over the next couple of days to go do that. So I will see you then. If you haven't subscribed as yet, please consider doing so. It means the world to me to know that people want to watch more stuff. I'll see you next time for some more photography chat, and in the meantime, take care, go safe.